Good afternoon. My name is Eric Peterson. I am the director of the Pelican Center for Technology and Innovation. It has been quite some time since we've done a Pelicast. A lot has happened since then. We are really glad to have you with us. We're going to be talking about rural broadband and all things connectivity. But before you do us a huge favor. Make sure to like and share this video. We know a lot of people are interested in rural broadband and bringing more innovation to Louisiana. So sharing that would do us a huge favor. Also, if you have any questions, make sure to drop them in the chat. We would love to answer them. But without any further ado, we have a special guest for this Pelicast from a sister think tank from our friends in Mississippi at the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. We have Matt Nicaud. And Matt, why are you on the Pelicast with me today?
Well, we have an exciting announcement. You and me are both going to be releasing already did actually release an exciting groundbreaking report on broadband policy in Louisiana and Mississippi. And it outlines some data points for people to consider. And then it also gives some important policy recommendations as well for broadband in our states. So it's exciting as well from Mississippi Center for Public Policy to join with Pelican Institute in this exciting report.
Yeah, as I'm sure you work on tech issues in Mississippi, and I'm sure
that's right.
The issue that I get asked most about is internet connectivity, right? What can we do to make sure that the rural areas in our state are connected? How can we start getting to that digital divide? And this was sort of our attempt to put some answers to that question and really bring some data to it. So why don't I just let you start? Give us a sort of broad overview of the paper. What did the paper look to do? What sort of questions did we consider?
Sure. So the first thing the paper did was, we wanted to kind of give an overview of the digital landscape in Louisiana, Mississippi. And first thing we did to do that was we have two really, really exciting maps that give a breakdown of how does connectivity look in our states. And so, it shows what percentage are connected. And then from there, it kind of breaks down the reasons why portions of our states are not connected. And one of the main things we found was that connectivity availability is an important issue, but adoption is also one of our biggest issues in our states. So we found that even though a lot of counties and parishes are behind from a connectivity standpoint, one of the biggest problems is just getting people interested in being connected. You have to explain to people why is it important that you're connected? How is it going to help Mississippians and Louisianans to be connected? And so that's we cover some of the reasons why it's good for people to be connected in the report, but then we also give some policy recommendations as well on how to expand that connectivity and what boundaries are currently in place that are stopping that connectivity.
Yeah, I just saw a new study, not from us, but I believe the number was for every two people or for every one person who doesn't have access to the internet, there are two people who do have access who aren't connected. So right. it is a big issue. But let's stick with the maps real quick. So, I think a lot of people believe there's kind of greater access problems than there are in the state. Sort of what do the numbers look like overall? And for the areas that don't have access, what do those areas look like? What do those areas have in common? What's stopping them from getting connected?
Yeah, so there are a couple of different issues. Obviously, one of the biggest issues is how rural those areas are. And as most people probably have already guessed, areas that are more rural are going to have less connectivity. But interestingly enough, one of the things that we found was that even if an area is not extremely rural, if it doesn't have the infrastructure necessary to have a robust broadband network, it's not going to be as connected. And from a further standpoint, I think it's important to recognize that one of the main issues is the fees and other regulatory boundaries that are associated with broadband. So, we might think, it's just simply a matter of getting people, getting the wires ran and then everyone's connected. But there's a lot more nuance to the problem. And that goes everything from OneTouch ready, for instance, if you have
let's get into that. So you talked a little bit about those regulatory barriers. So if I'm an internet provider and I want to reach people, what are some of the fees that I might run into? What are some of the roadblocks that are in the way from mostly state or local government.
Right. So one of the main fees is you're going to have connectivity fees. So, say, for instance, to use certain aspects of infrastructure, whether that be electrical infrastructure or other poles or anything like that, there are going to be fees that you're going to have to pay to your state and or local government in order to do that. And so one of the main things we recommend is lowering those fees as much as possible, so that broadband connectors can use that infrastructure without having to pay these huge fees. Because let's be honest, in some of these areas, their profit margins are already fairly low as it is. And if you're connecting to an area that has only about a couple thousand folks, your numbers are very low as it is. And so if you add a regulatory burden on top of that, that cuts into it even more. And companies in the free market are just going to say, hey, when we break down the regulatory cost and consider the fact that we're only connecting a smaller number of customers, we can't justify it. And so I think it's important that we lower those regulatory boundaries and the regulatory cost, so that the free market has more of an incentive to go to these rural areas.
Yeah, even with all these fees, it seems like the market is getting to a lot of it. One of the things that we look at in the paper is the widespread adoption and availability of the internet. It's expanded greatly over generations, not just how many people have access, but how fast it is. So what are some of the new technologies that might be really well positioned to reach folks in these rural areas where running fiber to every house just doesn't make any kind of economic sense, even if these government barriers were removed?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So one of the main ways that we can get rural areas connected is through 5G. And 5G, some may be aware of how it works, some may not. And 5G is basically this: it's little small cell networks that a large cell phone tower, for instance. We're all familiar with 4G. That's what we use for apps and stuff like that. That's going to cover a very large area, but it's not going to have a very fast speed compared to your wired broadband connecting. While 5G uses a little bit of a different approach. It has little small cell towers. They're about the size of a pizza box all throughout the region, and they essentially serve as little connectors for people to get connected on a higher speed. And so because the bandwidth is so much heavier and can carry so much more data, you get a lot faster speeds. And then another one, and this is somewhat literally right on the horizon, is satellite connectivity. And there are some exciting developments from companies like the one that Elon Musk started. And who knows? I mean, in 10 years, this whole broadband connectivity issue may be almost completely solved by these newer technologies. But I still think it's important that policymakers pay attention to specifically how can we solve this issue now, because people don't want to have to wait 10 years or 5 years to get connected. It's important that we do what we can to do that, connect them now.
Yeah, absolutely. COVID has shown how important closing the digital divide right now can be for so many people as they're relying on things like telehealth and virtual learning. You talked a little bit about some of that wireless technology, whether it's 5G or fixed wireless internet. Why is a policy like OneTouch Make Ready so important? And what is that policy?
Yeah, so OneTouch Make Ready is a really interesting policy. What it is we've all seen when you're driving down the road and you see the big giant utility poles that are on the side, and there's these big giant trenches for road work and stuff like that, and they're putting everything from electric wires to plumbing to all sorts of other things. And now on the flip side, whenever you consider it from a broadband standpoint, we don't usually think of, when we think of road work and other things like that, we don't usually think of those in terms of that's a great opportunity to put in broadband. But what OneTouch does is that it uses the power poles, and it uses underground trenches that are being dug, and it says you don't need to get additional licensing and do all types of other boundaries in order to get connected and to use these lines for broadband use. So that's a very important policy, because what it does is it lowers the amount of red tape that's required to use the electric power poles and to use these underground lines for broadband lines as well.
So it seems like we have a pretty good idea of how to expand access, right? It's focus on these rural areas that we've shown really lack that problem, and then find the technology that best fits that area, and try to remove those red tape and those barriers, and let the private sector get out there. But what about the adoption issue? It's something we hinted about at the beginning of this, that I always say that broadband is not a field of dreams. Just because you build it doesn't mean people are going to get
Right.
connected. So, what is the paper? What did we find out about this issue, and what are some ways that we suggest dealing with it?
Yeah, so the adoption issue is really important. And I think that goes. There are really two parts to this puzzle. Of course, you have on a personal level, you want people to get educated on why using broadband can improve their personal lives, and then on a business level, how if you're a business and you've been around for 40 years, how is broadband connectivity going to help you? And rather than saying let's establish some government program to do this, I think it's important that we look to the private sector, to the nonprofit sector, and say, hey, is there anything that the government can do to get out of the way so that you guys can more effectively accomplish the goal of educating people on why internet and broadband connectivity can increase their lives, increase their quality of life, and increase their business profitability. And so I think it's important to have, a sort of public-private partnership between government and these groups. To help the government helps to educate these educational groups on what they can do to help communities, and then those educational groups are able then to go help those communities and educate them on why it's important to use broadband and how it can help people.
Yeah, I mean, during the pandemic, again, we saw how much like schools, those sort of local community anchors, played a really important role in not only getting people connected, but a lot of families weren't sure how to sign up for internet, or wasn't sure how to pay for it, and they sort of worked through these issues. But also looks like groups like farm bureaus are great, especially for agricultural areas. And ag tech is something that you guys are really excited about working on in Mississippi. Like Louisiana, you're a big agriculture state. What does the future of like internet look like for the agricultural sector? How can it help improve connectivity and profitability for these folks?
Well, that's a great question. So for agricultural technology, there are tons of applications for internet in this sector, and specifically, one of the biggest things that I've noticed in my research has been the potential of wireless internet, wireless high speed internet for these agricultural technologies. So, say for instance, if you have an automated tractor and you want that tractor to be able to be fully controlled from your smartphone or from your desktop, but in order to do that, you have to have some type of way for the internet for the tractor to talk to your smartphone or to talk to your desktop. And in order to do that, you have to have a way to connect. And so I think that one of the biggest ways to do that could be through technologies like 5G. If you have massive amounts of data on, say, for instance, the amount of crops that you're bringing in, or the amount of pesticides that are being sprayed, or all of these data points that need to be fed into some type of database, you have to have a way to do that from an internet perspective. And so it's also, even from a safety perspective, if you don't have a way to connect your tractors or connect your safety equipment to the internet, then you don't have a reliable way to ensure that safety precautions are kept in place. And so it's vitally important, not just from an economic perspective, but also from a safety perspective, to have a way that you can feed data directly from these technologies to your control center. So that's, and of course, also then you get into other things like drones and literally the sky is the limit for agriculture technology and the use of the internet.
Yeah, well, like you said, again, a lot of wireless internet right there. So using sort of different kinds of technologies to connect folks seems like it's going to be really important.
Right.
A lot of states have gotten some federal money coming down, and so there's a lot of interest in doing stuff on broadband policy. So as we kind of wrap up talking about our paper, what are some of our recommendations for lawmakers in terms of getting the policy right so that those dollars that have to be spent on broadband are go as far as they can, but more importantly that we empower the private sector to continue to make those investments in rural areas?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the most important issues is to be focused on how many people are going to get connected. Policymakers shouldn't get focused on a particular technology, whether that be wired through the old-fashioned way through telephone connectivity lines, which can be fairly effective in many cases. We shouldn't get all that hooked up on fiber. We should be technology neutral. And so whenever lawmakers are trying to decide how do we distribute these funds to these various broadband providers, they shouldn't base it strictly upon the status quo. They should be willing to look at what are the innovative ways that internet is being brought in the 21st century, and what are the ways that we can most effectively use these taxpayer dollars so that the most people get connected in the most efficient way possible. And so I would say staying technology neutral is probably one of the most important ways to do that.
Yeah, and how can they make sure those dollars go as far as possible? What are some of the sort of fees and taxes that most lawmakers might not even realize that their states are charging?
Yeah, so as you touched on a little earlier, you have the fees associated with connectivity. So, if, say for instance, if you're using power poles and you're using things like that, I think one important thing to do is to have caps on the amount of fees that can be charged. So, say for instance, you have a power pole that's being used, there should be a cap and a limit on how much is going to be charged per power pole per broadband company. So I think that's another one important way. And then another way would be to also ensure that in a holistic sense, looking at each individual regulation and saying, yes, this has been the way that we've done it in the past, but how can we effectively change this to make it work, and so that people can get connected as far and as effectively as possible. And we get into that a lot in detail in the report. So.
Yeah, we even highlighted how some of the taxes and fees don't make a lot of sense. Mississippi, for example, taxes wireless equipment at a much lower rate than sort of wired equipment. We just got done talking about how important wireless connectivity is going to be. That sort of doesn't make any sense if we're trying to expand connectivity and want those dollars to go as far as possible and to really utilize those private dollars. Well, I think that's about all the time we have today, Matt. So if you have sort of one takeaway for somebody watching this, what is that our paper gets at? What should they take away from the paper?
Yeah, so I think that one of the biggest takeaways would be, in the wake of COVID, we've realized just how important broadband connectivity is. And when we look at broadband connectivity, so much of everything that's to do with broadband is tied directly into public policy. And so I think it's important to, number one, understand where our states are. And we can do that through looking at the maps, looking at the data, looking at the available information that we have. And then number two, looking at the policy methodologies that can be used to lower fees, to lower regulations, and to make sure that people don't just get connected, but that they also adopt the technology of high-speed internet. So I would say that that's some of the key takeaways that we should keep in mind as we work towards getting people connected.
Awesome. Well, Matt, thank you so much for your time. You can go read the paper either at pelicanpolicy.org, or Matt, what's your website?
mspolicy.org.
Awesome.
Mississippi Center for Public Policy.
So obviously you can go follow us on social media. You can go visit our website, see this policy. But again, thank you so much for tuning in today. Make sure to leave us a comment, give us a like, give us a share, and check out this paper. We think you'll learn a lot, and hopefully it'll help us close the digital divide in our states. Thanks so much for joining us, Matt.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it.